Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the Working Group 1 meeting for the Extended Day-Ahead Market Initiative related to supply commitment and resource efficiency evaluation. This is Christina Osborne from my Stakeholder Engagement Group. I'll be providing support for the meeting, and sorry about that introduction there. I was having technical difficulties, so I had to go back into practice session, but we're back now. Mark Richardson is the facilitator, and Bob Codd is the scribe for this working group. We also have Phil Pettengill, who's the coordinator overseeing all three of the Edam working groups. And also joining us as a panelist today is Milos Pasonic, who is the lead policy developer for the Edam initiative. But before I go over the agenda, I just wanted to call to your attention, we made a temporary adjustment to the schedule for all three of the working groups. So as noted on this slide, there will be one session per week for each working group over the next couple of weeks. And then we'll return to our original meeting cadence of 2 meetings per week starting the week of February 14th. So Milos, I know you wanted to add to this, so I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Christina, and good afternoon, everybody. This is Milos with the California ISO. Let me maybe just first take a moment to acknowledge everybody's hard work, the time commitment, and the robust participation we've really seen from stakeholders in these working groups. We really appreciate the good dialogue and the amount of engagement that we've seen across all three of the working groups, so really appreciate that. To echo what Christina noted, I just wanted to note that in response to some of the stakeholder requests, we will now move to a one working group meeting per week for the next couple of weeks. As we delve into the substance of the design of the different working group topics, we heard really from a number of stakeholders that they would benefit from some additional time to evaluate the concepts internally within their organization, but also with other stakeholders in order to more actively engage in these discussions and represent their positions and perspectives. So we hope that stakeholders will take this opportunity to find alignment, prep, and caucus on the different working group topics, and really actively discuss and share those perspectives in upcoming meetings to really help us continue making progress in these working groups. I think that engagement and that time for stakeholders to vet certain concepts internally and with other like-minded stakeholders is really important to help us move these working groups forward. So hopefully you take the time during the meeting sessions that have been canceled to do some of that work, and you can then more actively help us move and make progress in these working groups. I also want to highlight that we'll be hosting monthly working group debrief meetings. We issued a market notice, I believe, a bit earlier today, and one is scheduled for mid-February, I believe, February 16th, and then another debrief meeting will be scheduled for the March 18th. And these sessions are intended really to take stock of where we are with the working groups in regards to the design that's being discussed, provide a status update, and then what is coming up next, give a little bit of a window into where we're going with the next topics. And this also, I think, is going to allow the ability for us and for stakeholders to highlight areas of interdependencies between working group topics and design frameworks that we've been working on together. For stakeholders that may not have an opportunity really to participate in all of the working groups up to now, I think these monthly meetings will also provide a good opportunity to debrief and get a sense of the discussions across the different topics. So we hope that this added debrief meeting, the two that are coming up, one in mid-February and one in mid-March, will provide, again, an opportunity to more holistically view the progress that we've made, but also will provide the ability for stakeholders to get a sense of where we've been and where we're going. So I'll pause there. Thank you, everybody, again, for joining us today. And Christina, I'll turn it over back to you.
Great. Thank you, Milos. I did add a link to the notice that went out earlier today about those debrief meetings. I added that to the chat in case you didn't see it. So as far as the agenda, Mark is going to provide an overview of the two proposed frameworks for RSE, and then you'll continue the discussion on the resource qualifications and RSE counting. And then, of course, we have time at the end. We'll provide a recap of the discussion and then talk about the topics for the meeting next week. And then just a few reminders for you. Again, we encourage you to share your perspectives during these meetings. So if at any time you have a question or want to say anything, please raise your hand. There's a little hand icon above the chat window. If you logged into WebEx, if you just dialed in, please press pound 2. And again, just a reminder to please identify yourself first. And then the meetings are this meeting being recorded. We will post the video file once we receive it from the media vendor. Usually takes about 2 to 3 business days before we receive it, and we'll post it out on the working group webpage. That's where you'll find all the other materials for this working group. And then also, if you're interested in presenting at an upcoming meeting, please reach out to us. There's a link on the resources page at the end of the slide deck. Please use that link, submit your request, and the ISO will reach out to you and coordinate the details. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the meeting over to Mark.
Thank you, Christina. Can you confirm you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
All right. Good afternoon, team. I appreciate everyone taking the time today to continue our efforts in this space, and hope everyone had a great weekend. For today's objectives, as Christina mentioned, I really want to kind of continue our discussion on some of these relevant RSC scope topics. And really, it's circling back to demand response and accounting. How is that going to be accredited and taken into account for purposes of the RSC? And then I really, if time permits, wanted to tee up the discussion around the WSPP Schedule C arrangements and how that plays into the RSC. Next slide here, Christina. All right, so with this slide, I wanted to take a quick temperature check on where we left off after last week's discussion. I believe I heard 2 different Rsc framework approaches coming to light, and I wanted to ensure with the team that I captured them correctly here. The first approach was a proposal that George at the ISO laid out that was primarily based on the bids being provided. The second approach is a flavor of PowerX original presentation that had a concept of a day-ahead operations plan. Now, before moving to the next slide and looking at each of these approaches a little bit more in detail, I did want to state that the purpose of walking through these 2 ideas is to ensure we're all tracking together, not necessarily to get into the design details and elements of each of these items. As Milos mentioned, my ask would be for the stakeholders to kind of utilize the updated meeting cadence, both this week and next, as an opportunity to take these approaches back and discuss amongst one another. I can reach out to the different parties offline to see where they stand on these approaches and then see if they would be willing to present this coming Monday. I will also ask the ISO to be prepared to share their perspectives on these different approaches. Next slide, and then we'll go ahead and start taking questions after I go through this next slide here. All right, waiting for, oh, there it goes. All right, so the first concept was the ISO's proposal based on stakeholder feedback to potentially have a bid-based approach where a new bid component would be added that would allow for the SC to provide an advisory operating schedule for the coming days' planned operations. Now, this advisory operation schedule, if provided, would be utilized in place of the energy bids to inform the RSC on which hours to give credit for with respect to the resource's energy limitations. Now, this concept first arose from a hydro and battery resources conversation that we had a few meetings back, but with the discussions around fuel resources and potential burn limitations, I think there's an opportunity as a group to expand this functionality to all resources types. Now, the meaning, let me pause there and give you guys a moment to kind of soak in this, and I'll go through some of these concerns here in a second. Now, if you recall, this advisory schedule is a new bid component, right? And I know a few stakeholders kind of called out, hey, to the extent we're going to have to provide this new bid component, we have, technology concerns, as well as, how do we know what's the best way to utilize this resource from a day-ahead plans operation standpoint? That's more of a resource function, or maybe it's a BAA function. So let me pause there and see if we have any questions. I did see Kathleen's hand pop up really fast, so let me go to Kathleen.
Hi, Mark. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I just thought I'd get in the queue. You said you were opening it up, so apologies for jumping in too fast. Can you go back a slide? So I appreciate you recapping this. I did want to maybe share, and I think it's all maybe perspective, looking at the same conversation from different viewpoints. But I'm noticing in your kind of summary of this, kind of how you walk through it, it seems like you're kind of looking at it from the perspective of what is used within the resource efficiency evaluation test, a bid-based, a profile, where the way that I experienced the last conversation we had, just for some maybe a different perspective, was actually at a higher level. So elevating what is used to what type of test, like how would the test function? And I heard three, maybe four, but three potential options for that. I heard a simple resource sufficiency evaluation that would check each hour and ramping between hours. So maybe that's what your first bullet is kind of alluding to. I heard the flip side of that. In the same kind of test, you could also use that profile, which I think is the second bullet, which is perhaps why I'm trying to kind of highlight there's a different way to look at it, right? So I think whether or not you did bid or you did a profile could still be done in that simple test. But then I heard two other things that were added to the conversation. So the two other frameworks, the extreme being to perform an optimization with the bids. So that would be using just the first sub-bullet, bid-based, but within an optimization, and pros and cons of that. And then I think a few others suggested we keep our minds open and consider something in between these two as a middle ground. And I think George kind of used those words, which was good. And just if it's helpful to put an idea out there of what I think is maybe in between this simpler RSC we do for real EIM today and the more extreme intensive optimization approach is adding an idea of a daily energy check on top of or in addition to the hourly, 24-hourly check for the demand and ramping needs. We could add a daily energy check that would respect the energy limitations of resources across the day, but not have to define exactly when. So that would be kind of the middle ground. So I had been entering into the conversation thinking we'd talk about kind of those three, maybe more mechanisms than the inputs. Does that make sense?
No, it does. So let me get to the next slide after we get through this first approach, because I think that's a little bit more in line with your daily energy check. As to the other extreme example that you highlighted where, essentially kind of going back to use George's words, running a market before the market. I did hear that in last week's discussion. I didn't know how much traction that gained, and I'd be happy to, as a group, talk about that here as well. And let me put a little more context around the advisory schedule. So in George's presentation, there was this advisory schedule bid component being provided. As part of the bid, the evaluation would actually utilize that, or at least through the discussion, what I walked away with was the evaluation would utilize that advisory schedule instead of the actual energy bid itself. And when I say bid, I mean self-schedule and or economic energy bid curve, right? So anything absent that advisory operation schedule, the RSC would then leverage the bid. So let me just state that. That's what I walked away with from that, and hopefully you did as well. Let me go to Carrie Bentley. Carrie, are you muted on your side, Carrie?
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley. I was just unmuted by the operator. Sorry about that. So Carrie Bentley, Western Power Trading Forum. You had just asked whether we had the same impression, and it sounded like you didn't feel like there was support for what Kathleen just described. And I want to say I came away with a little bit different of an impression. That hybrid approach is the one that WPTF supports. And we thought that that would be similarly discussed to the two options that you just presented.
Yeah.
So just a little bit of a different understanding. Yeah.
Right. Is your hybrid approach, and I don't know if George is on the call, but is your hybrid approach where these energy limitations would be provided as part of this advisory schedule, but then the ISO would somewhat optimize over the 24-hour period when best to use those?
Well, I wouldn't call it an optimization so much as simply a aggregate energy check. So I believe it was Danny Johnson who described it the first time, and I was imagining it wouldn't be bid-in schedules. It would just be a capacity check in each hour, and then there would be an aggregate energy check such that the total energy would be compared to either the capacity or, if it was use limited, that megawatt hour limitation.
Gotcha. Okay, I'm capturing that here as a aggregate energy check for capacity. So let me.
And Mark, for what it's worth, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I was calling it a daily energy check. You can call it whatever you want to call it. I think that what Carrie just described makes a lot of sense and would be supportive of pursuing.
Per hour basis.
Yeah, and distinct from bids completely. At least that was my understanding of what was proposed and what at least our members seemed most supportive of. So definitely would appreciate it being added to the mix.
No, I appreciate the feedback, and that's exactly what I wanted today. So thank you both for your thoughts.
Thanks, Mark.
Yep. All right. So I see George in the queue. George, did you want to chime in?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. This is George Angelidis with the ISO. Let's clear out a few things, because I think we're not all on the same page. I think none of these alternatives involve any kind of optimization. There are two alternatives for using either the bids or the submitted advisory operational schedule to perform the capacity and flexibility test for each hour over the day. And none of this, the way they were articulated and proposed, involve any sort of optimization. The optimization model to use those two, to use the bids and the capability of resources to position them optimally to pass the test, that will be some third alternative that we haven't really discussed. It's on the table if it is important, if it gets traction, as Mark mentioned, but we haven't really proposed anything specific about it. So for the two alternatives that have been discussed, there is no optimization process. This energy check is essentially a validation on the operational schedule, make sure that it's feasible, make sure that it's something that the market can attain with the bid. So that's why we're saying that the schedule has to be within the bid range, has to be attainable, and then what is submitted across the day should not violate the daily energy limit. So that's just a validation. There's no optimization in that. I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
No, George, so, and I see Carrie coming back in. So Carrie, do you mind maybe just giving a little more context around this aggregate energy check? I understand it was a per hourly basis, but going back to what George just stated, I would like to hear your reaction there. So let me go to Carrie first.
Hi, I'm a little confused. Maybe you misheard me, George. I specifically said I would not call it an optimization. It's just a check that you have sufficient energy across the day without having to do an hourly specific check. So I wasn't even sure whether, George, you were responding to me or whether you were responding to something else.
Partly I was responding to you, Carrie, but maybe I misunderstood what you meant. If you're saying an energy requirement across the day, are you thinking of a test that is not performed for every hour, but it's performed for the entire day, and you have an energy requirement for the day, and then you're crossing against that energy requirement, whatever is provided by the operational schedule? Is this what you're thinking?
Yep, exactly. Simply because, energy doesn't have to be in any specific hour, and there's no limits that hydro has to be, an hour 5 through hour 10. So no need to have it be hourly, just simplify things and have a megawatt hour requirement across the day and a check on that.
Okay, that will be a third alternative then, because the other two involve a specific hourly requirement check test So that will be a different test that instead of being performed for each hour of the day, you perform the test for the entire day. And we had some discussion early on in this work group between these two alternatives of whether we're going to have a test for the entire day or whether a test for each hour. And I'm under the impression that we got traction on the hour-by-hour test because we were also concerned about the fact of having some consequences for failing the test, and nobody felt comfortable having a consequence that if you fail the test for the day, you're having that consequence for the entire day. If you have the test failed for an hour, you only have that consequence for an hour. It seems a little bit more modest, the penalty that you'll have to endure if you fail the test. That was one of the reasons. And the other reason was that we didn't feel that a daily test could certainly make sure that you're not leaning at any given hour. It just says overall over the day you're good, but depending on the bits that you're submitting, on peak, off peak, we cannot really ascertain whether you may be leaning at any given hour. So that's why we gravitated towards an hourly test. Are you considering going back, bringing on the table the daily test?
Well, certainly I'm not proposing we go back to the peak hourly test where you just pick 1 hour and you have to meet that, which I think much of the initial discussion focused on. I'm just trying to highlight a way that I thought was discussed to figure out how to do energy limited resources. You could include an hourly capacity component along with the test, but I just think rather than people having to match their hourly use limited resources to a specific schedule, you could get to the same result by doing a megawatt hour requirement and check for the whole day, not 1 hour, but for all 24 hours, but just 1 megawatt hour check. Because otherwise you really are forcing people to kind of put in false bids where, you know, meeting their own demand from their energy limited resources. And it just seems simpler to me rather than doing these pretend kind of bids to just say, okay, you have this megawatt hour requirement, here's my megawatt hour supply, and then, you know, validate it that way. And it is a third option, George. Yeah, I would agree with that.
All right, yeah. Okay. Fine, but there are no pretend bids, though. I mean, let me make this clear. These bids that are used in the resource efficiency evaluation are the same financially binding bids that will be used in the market. So we don't have a different set of bids for RSC that wouldn't raise issues regarding their, you know, their validity, right? So let's take that off. But I understand now your proposal, something for the energy requirement of the day, instead of the specific hourly capacity across our flexibility. So if you cover the energy, how do you cover flexibility, Carrie? You have to make sure that your proposal is complete.
Yeah, and Carrie, maybe I'll ask you to take this offline, Carrie, and let's work together offline and maybe bring this third option back this coming Monday. That way we can kind of continue looking at these two separate options that I had previously captured. I hear your third approach, and I would definitely like to hear what other stakeholders think of it.
I just want to say I'm a little bit confused. This is not my third approach. This was the approach that I thought was suggested by different stakeholders. So just to be clear, WPTF is not pitching this. I'm just raising something that yeah, okay, yeah, this got support. Yeah, we have WPTF doesn't want to bring anything. We are just an engaged stakeholder reflecting on options, and so we're reflecting that this third option got support among our membership, so we'd like it to be added. Yeah.
Understood. Thank you. All right, let me go to Steve Kearns.
Hello, everybody. Steve Kearns, Public Generating Pool. I actually think we're really close here, but I'm struggling, I think, like both Carrie and Kathleen, with understanding really what the alternatives are that we're talking about. The slide in front of us talks about the bid-based sufficiency framework, which uses hourly bids to demonstrate. I'm sorry, you moved from me.
You're going to want to go back a slide, Christian. There we go. Thank you.
There we go. Yeah. So this framework that's outlined here, where you would submit bids on every hour, to demonstrate capacity and flexibility sufficiency. And then you'd have the advisory operating schedule to demonstrate the ability to meet your energy obligations. So I don't know what the other alternative is that you're proposing. To me, this is kind of what we landed on. And to Carrie's point, you know, whether or not we use an advisory operating schedule or a daily energy limit, I think they both get at the same thing. And I would just suggest that whatever's easiest, we ought to focus on.
Yep. So Steve, you're stating this slide here captures where you believed one of the foundational framework items came out last week?
Yes. And so
Okay.
what is the alternative that is being proposed to this from CAISO's perspective?
So, and we'll get there next, because I did hear two distinct items last week, but I believe Carrie was speaking on behalf of multiple stakeholders, this third approach where it was the aggregate energy check across the day.
Well, yeah. So the energy check is another way to do the advisory operating schedule. It's another way to demonstrate that you have sufficient energy to meet your obligations. And to the extent that the optimization is eventually going to optimize around your energy limits anyway, that might be the easiest way to do it because that's data that the market participant's going to have to provide anyway.
Steve, on this one, I believe the hourly operation schedule has the advantage that we can also use it for the capacity test at any given hour. So if we have the energy over the day, we won't be able to count the resource for contributing to the capacity test at any given hour. So I think it's more advantageous to think of the hourly operational schedule profile.
So I think you're right, George, if the resource doesn't have bids. But if the resource does have bids, then you would use the bids for the capacity check, right?
Well, no. So remember in the go ahead, George. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Maybe let's clear this misunderstanding, make sure we're all on the same page. No, using the bids for an energy limited resource, we did conclude that it's inappropriate for resource efficiency evaluation tests because the bids don't really reflect the true capability of the resource. So the bids, I mean, you can have bids for the entire range of the capacity of the resource every hour. So for energy limited resource, we're not going to use the bids, we'll use the schedule. So if the resource is from 0 to 100 and submits bids from 0 to 100, but it has a schedule at 60, we'll use 60 megawatts for that hour. We're not going to use 100 for the upward test and 0 for the lower test. That's what we were.
George, that the advisory operating schedule had to be between their min and their max bids.
Yeah, it's between 0 and 100 in the example, like 60, right? And we're going to use it at 60.
So you would use 60 megawatts even though it's got the potential to reach 100 megawatts?
Because we don't know if it has the potential to reach 100 because of its energy limitation, which is reflected by different hourly schedules, different hourly operational schedules across the day. So that's why it's either or, right? Either you're not energy limited and we're using your bid, so 100 maximum, 0 minimum, or you're energy limited and we'll use this operational schedule, which is whatever it is. So let's say 60, right? You have these two choices, right?
Well, so when we talked about it last week, George, and I made allow for the consideration of uncertainty and reserves, you correctly pointed out that you had you'd be able to kind of raise the demand as well as consider the actual capacity of each of the resources as submitted in the bid curves. So I'd kind of envision it maybe a little bit differently than the way you're describing it now.
Yeah, and Steve,
okay.
Hold on one second, George, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So what we could do, so what I captured and walked away with last week, which I believe the group did as well, is this advisory operating schedule bid component, if provided, would be leveraged by the RSC. And that advisory operating schedule component would reflect the use limitation or energy limitation across the full 24-hour period. Right. Yep. And then based on that, the RSC would accredit those megawatts for the associated hours provided. The EDAM optimization itself is not looking at this advisory operating schedule. And I know George, so I know George had a presentation on this last week. I'll go back and take a look at it as well, just to ensure I'm tracking. But what we can do is maybe take this offline. I could follow up with you, Steve, after for some of these questions you may have, and then we'll take it from there.
I think that sounds good. And I think what I'm suggesting is in line of what Carrie was getting at also. So maybe if we all wanted to take it offline together, that might be a good conversation.
Sure. I appreciate that. And I'm making a note. And George, I may pull you in from a subject matter expert standpoint as well. All right, let me go to Petter.
Hey, George, this is Petter from SGM. I really don't understand why you are trying to avoid optimization. First of all, there is no hybrid between two approaches, because in optimization approach or bid approach, people can bid self-schedules part plus portion of the segment as a bid. So there is no hybrid approach. There is either fixed schedules or bids, and that gives people maximum flexibility. They can build only everything fixed schedule or everything bid or portion fixed schedule, portion bid. Now I hear concerns about intensive optimization. This optimization is not intensive at all, because you don't have to consider the transmission. You don't have to distribute load with load distribution factors. You don't have to do startup, shutdown, minimum up and down time, all those complex stuff. The only big question is, are you going to consider movement of multi-stage generators or not as possible change? So that optimization is going to be very fast. It can be implemented as a tool for people to work with that on internet. And it's going to be much easier for them to avoid scenarios where they are resource sufficient, but tools that they're using are not going to create fixed schedules for them. So they're going to fail because they don't have schedules that optimally use their assets for 24 hours to pass the test. So I really don't understand why you are trying to avoid optimization, why it's so complex, and why not giving people maximum flexibility and minimum effort to prepare their operation day ahead with or without other tools. Plus, when they start in the morning for next day, by 9 o'clock, they better have already very close their bid kind of asset portfolio completely figured out, so they can be passing tests between 9 and 10 a.m. So I really, with all this in mind, don't understand why you running away from optimization. There are many other things that you will have hard time to avoid leaning, like what I believe Alva mentioned about charging batteries and things like that.
No, thanks for your comments, Peter, of course. And as I said earlier here, the option of having an optimization model to optimize the bids with the target of passing the test is still on the table. If we get traction on that, we'll consider it more. So far, and maybe because I kept saying we don't want to run the market before we run the market, that is really dependent on how complicated and elaborate and intelligent you want to make this optimization model. And you did mention already, transmission constraints, which takes a lot out of the complexity of the model. But there are other things as well, and you did mention MSG transition. So, with the intent to have this simple enough to be run on demand by any entity, even if we move in that direction, which of course it has a lot of advantages because it will make the best possible choice of the bids and takes out the guesswork from any particular Edam entity, because what can beat optimization, right? However, it's really dependent on what constraints we're going to model in it and how sophisticated it will be. And yes, we can come up with something very simple that doesn't include transitions from MSGs or startups and intertemporal constraints of that sort. And then we'll meet the goal of having something simple enough to possibly make it on demand. But, you know, from experience, I know that when you make proposals like that, there is the counter proposal of it's too simple, it doesn't address the constraints, it may result to inaccuracies, we need to also include these constraints, and then it gets more and more complicated. So there is a silver lining there to reach a reasonable trade-off between complexity and accuracy. And if we miss that, then we won't be able to make it available as an on-demand application. So, but anyway, if there is interest to the stakeholders to pursue such an action, such an option, we will discuss it. Nothing is off the table here, really. Thank you.
Thank you, George. And maybe I'll get, you know, Southwest, Northwest, or some California entities to weigh in on this as well. I see Kevin Smith in the queue. Go ahead, Kevin.
Hey, good afternoon. Kevin Smith, Balancing Authority in Northern California. I just wanted to follow up on Peter's proposal. It's kind of intriguing. I think the issue was we were trying to do something simple, clean, and that we would have the opportunity to cure if there were, you know, deficiencies. So we could go back, purchase bilaterally. And this is like way outside my pay grade, so I won't even pretend to understand what the timelines would be, but I'd be kind of curious as to what that might entail as far as running the optimization. I mean, are we talking about, because we've talked about having, for example, in transmission, ATC goes into the market at 3 p.m. or 3 p.m., 9 a.m., and that, to me, would be kind of your final RS deadline. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of discussion around what those timelines are, but is there sufficient time to cure, bottom line, if you were to run an optimization? Because there is some aspect of it that's attractive. I mean, you actually, and then you get into the complexity you just said, George, where, you know, okay, well, what about this constraint? And that's, you know, is that a slippery slope? And you end up with an imperfect optimization, doesn't really give you much that you can rely on. But I would be curious. I think it's an interesting concept because it would give you a little more of a picture of really what's going on and really whether this is sufficient, you know, resource sufficient, and you would be taking into account transmission and other things that you wouldn't know just by looking at it on paper and, you know, looking at each individual's RSE.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments, Kevin. George, did you want to weigh in on that, or would you like me to move to the next caller?
No, I don't have to say anything more than what I said earlier. I'm curious to see how stakeholders feel about this idea. As I said, if it's something that is of interest and, you know, it gets traction, we will definitely look into it. We can even make a presentation about how it will look like. So let's see.
And yeah, maybe that's a good takeaway, George. And, you know, for the audience, I've heard multiple stakeholders talk about, you know, the simplistic approach. You know, so maybe not rule out, we could always, or the ISO could always start with a, you know, extremely simple, quote unquote, optimization. And to the extent there's need for enhancements based on those results and things like that, you know, we could always move in that direction with stakeholders. Let me go to Alva next.
Hello, this is Alva Svoboda from PG&E. Basically, just to agree with a couple of points that were made. I do think already the bids that go into the market systems include energy limits for resources that are energy limited, and the addition of a profile is something new. So there's an additional informational requirement there. So I think aiming for an approach where you can use the bid information at a given point in time to enable balancing authorities to make an evaluation, and then essentially deciding what the consequences are of that is kind of the design aim here. The evaluation is not going to be perfect in any case. So what's going to be critical is how you evaluate curing efforts. For example, are BAAs required to procure additional emergency capacity if they fail? Do they have time to ask participants to change their bids or whatever? And that's going to be highly dependent on the time frame. Anything that's done at 9 a.m. I think is going to have to just be cured by some form of emergency procurement. You're not going to be able to change the bids anymore. And so that has to be recognized in looking at the potential failure of this. And just in general, I think the profile idea is just too sensitive to changes in forecasts or changes in system conditions to be robust in that time frame. It might be a perfectly good approach if you were doing putting together a stack of your resources a couple of hours ahead of time, and then confirming that as a BAA, you know that you have a profile that will satisfy your load forecast, and therefore you've passed resource efficiency, and nothing, and all of that essentially is just there for documentation. It has nothing to do with the bids. But anything that's making use of the bids, you have to be very concerned about the fact that you're going to be very limited in terms of being able to cure at 9 a.m. in my opinion. So
yeah, and Alva, you just hit on the next slide, and just for purposes of time, I think this is a good discussion. It sounds like it has enough interest to where I will ask George from the ISO to maybe put together a slide or two on this other approach and maybe lay out some of those pros and cons for the stakeholder community to think about. And I would also ask stakeholders to prepare, some of their thoughts around that and what the simple approach would look like versus some of those that are a little bit more complicated. All right, so, good segue there, Alva. I appreciate that. So this second slide here. Let's see. So the second approach. This is a concept of a day-ahead sufficiency plan. This approach would be outside the concept of the new bid component and may require a new tool to be created. This plan would include planned output amounts for each trade hour for the entire resource stack. Now, since this approach is outside of bidding, I believe there would be a tie between what is provided in the plan and what is actually getting bid into the market. I mean, with this approach, what role do bids play at all in the RSC? I think these are some of the questions as a group that we got to kind of consider when vetting this approach. I added a few key questions here, and I'm open to hearing from the audience on some of the other factors that we all need to consider with the day-ahead sufficiency plan. So the first question, who submits the day-ahead plan? Is it the load-serving entity? Is it the Edam entity? The complexity and risk of this, going back to some of the timing, is it by 6 a.m. that gets provided? And then maybe the last one being ran at 9 a.m., kind of consistent with what we talked about in some of the previous working groups where everyone kind of landed on that 9 a.m. being the last advisory run. And then what components should this account for? So let me pause there. And this day-ahead sufficiency plan was a little more in line with and kind of stems from a February, I believe it was 2020 presentation that PowerX put on. So let me pause there and see if I can get any comments, questions, reactions, or some of the other things that may need to be considered with this framework approach. Let's go to Kathleen first.
Hey, Mark. Thanks. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I actually just had a clarification question on the next step that you had noted, but I can respond to this or not. But I heard you ask George and the rest of the KISO team to take back some of this feedback and come forward with some responses on the optimization approach that was being discussed. can you also ask them to come back with some ideas on the daily energy test approach? I heard Carrie call that hybrid, the hybrid option. I think that would be really helpful as well. That's the two new ideas.
Yep, I made a note of it.
Thank you. Perfect. And I think I've already communicated why the reasons that VISTRA doesn't believe that the day-ahead sufficiency plan framework that you've laid out here is feasible, nor will it put the EDAM BAAs in the best opportunity for passing. It's not too much risk that the right offers aren't submitted and the right profiles aren't submitted if it's out of their control by another SC, and or if it is submitted that the way the profile has been formed is the driver of the failure rather than actually failing during an operating time horizon. So I'll just give it up to others, but we have to believe that this doesn't seem doable.
Yeah, Kathleen, when you say doesn't seem doable, you mean from an SC standpoint, or are you stating for an actual EDAM entity being responsible for providing this day-ahead plan, as they look, a day out in their planning horizon, putting together the list of resources and supply that's available to them to ensure reliable operations for the coming day?
No, that's a fair follow-up question. So I would assume that we'd have to set up a rule by which if it's not a utility-owned generator, the utility submitting the plan could not include them because they wouldn't have any transparency into the operations from a scheduling coordinator that is separate and independent from them, which is what I was alluding to, that this framework actually makes it more difficult to pass the test if they're not able to include the full set of generation available to support the test.
Gotcha. So you're saying the actual resources shown in the tests would have their own qualifying capabilities and things like that based on whether or not it's a third-party merchant generator?
I wouldn't overcomplicate it like that. What I'm saying is that if you're going to introduce an option for entities to submit profiles, and those are the only things allowed to be used in the RSE, and scheduling coordinator does not have that obligation, so it's a more risk-adverse assumption to make that the non-utility entity that's not the EDAM BAA entity or the EDAM entity would not submit that profile. And if the rules are set up in a way where the bids are not allowed for, let's say, a hydro or a storage or an LASR resource type, then the bids will be excluded. So you can logically take yourself down a path by which the EDAM entities are actually in a worse position by not allowing for the bids to be the basis of the test, because they would be at risk of whether or not that individual SC would or would not submit a profile, which is not their choice. So I just wouldn't overcomplicate it. It's just a simple matter of who has the right incentives here. And unless you somehow allocate consequences down to the non-utility generators, which I would argue I don't think is just and reasonable if that were to be a part of the conversation, I don't see how you think this framework incentivizes the full bid stack plus profiles being available for RSE.
Thank you, Kathleen. Let me see if I can get George or Danny from the ISO to weigh in on that.
I just want to provide a clarification. This is George, make sure we're all on the same page again. So what we're discussing here is that we have like a hybrid approach to do the RSC test. For resources that they don't have energy limitations, they don't have fuel limitations, of course we're going to use the bids, because the bids convey now for these resources the true capability that the participant is putting for the resource in the market. So we're going to use the bids for these resources. The question was always, and that's how it was raised here, that the bids are not really a good indication of the resource capability if the resource is fuel limited, like energy limited or whatever. So for these resources that are energy limited, the proposal that we formulated and present and discuss here is to use an advisory operational schedule instead of the bid, all right? Because I hear Alva saying the bids represent, they include energy limitations, but from the purpose of the test, we don't know that, right? So the idea is to use the bids for non-energy limited and use the schedules, the advisory schedules for energy limited, and then we perform the hourly capacity and flexibility test using those two. So I view it as a hybrid approach. We never really suggested not using the bids for all resources. That was not in the proposal. So I just want to make sure we clarify that point.
Thank you, George. I see Danny as well. Danny, did you have a comment?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So I'm not sure these two plans are really that separate. I almost see the optimization idea as one way that an entity could get a handle on producing an energy profile for storage limited resources that would then be used and evaluated against on an hourly basis. I think that we would want to ensure that to the extent that both go forward or there's some hybrid, there's a common rule set about how a BA would want to develop their energy profile for use limited resources so that the potential optimization tool and any entity who doesn't choose it are having the same assumptions. But I almost view, again, the optimization tool as a feed in to help try to frame that energy profile for use limited resources. And then the other thing I would add is at least hearing the sufficiency plan, I've kind of viewed this as, yeah, it is an energy profile and an operating plan, but it would still be cross-validated to make sure that the bids could support that operating plan.
Thank you, Danny. I see Stuart in the queue, and then maybe I'll ask I don't know if Jeff Spires is on. I haven't checked, but to the extent Jeff's on, Jeff, this was kind of pulled from your presentation a few weeks back, so I don't know if you wanted to provide a bit more context as to what you originally intended this proposal to look like with the EIM entity. So let me go to Stuart Kelly next.
Thanks, Mark. This is Stuart Kelly, LA. As I said in previous meetings, I think, as Danny has talked about, as has Peter, I think we'd be better off with a simplified optimization approach. It helps bridge the gap with some of these use limited resources, but more importantly, when you actually fail the test, they give you very targeted hours to correct. I think we're underestimating the correction components of this over a 24-hour period if that's the way we proceed. So I think we should look at simplified optimization, but we have to look at it through a lens of we have to focus on the constraints that should be included versus not, because the objective is just to isolate the hours that we need to take some action, be it procurement of additional energy or bringing on additional resource or whatever it is that we plan to do. So I think that would be the best path forward.
Thank you, Stuart. And I see Jeff. So Doug, I see you in the queue. I will come to you next, but let me go to Jeff first to see if you want to provide a bit more context here, Jeff, or to see if maybe I captured that incorrectly in this slide. You might be double muted, Jeff.
Apologies. Can you hear me now?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mark. This is Jeff Spires with PowerX. I did jump on late, so I might have missed the question that you were asking specifically, but I think the way Danny was characterizing it a few minutes ago seemed pretty much the way I was thinking of this also, which is that, well, maybe I'll take a step back and say that I think when we first sort of contemplated a 24-hour plan, we had some assumptions that some entities were probably already doing something very similar to this in terms of an entity or a BA operator, whoever's responsible for day ahead planning would be looking at their load forecast for the following day, looking at the resource fleet that they have and making decisions about how they might operate those to meet their needs for the following day. And so it seemed like this framework could leverage some of those existing practices and then be used to provide a framework where the sufficiency test could be performed on a 24-hour basis, and entities could in effect be filling in a feasible operating plan ahead of time, much like they might do today, to show that they've got the capability to meet their needs over that period. But then ultimately the market would run and redispatch, and you might find that your resources are run in a different way that's more efficient, and that's fine. But from a resource efficiency point of view, you were kind of showing that you could balance your system on a standalone basis. But I think what Danny was starting to allude to there around, basically it's a simplistic optimization potentially of some kind to lay that out is also another way to get to the same result, which is just trying to show how would you kind of put your portfolio together. So I'm not sure, Mark, if I totally answered your question, but that's a little bit of background on the thinking.
No, that was perfect. And, kind of going back to some of the concerns I heard was this may be something that BAAs aren't doing today. And what I believe I heard you state is it sounds like some of them or most of them are. And, I would like to hear from the group if that's the case. And then, does that operation plan include some of these non-owned third-party resources as well?
Mark, just to clarify, I don't want to necessarily suggest that most entities are doing precisely this.
Okay.
I think that the discussion was that just at a conceptual level, looking ahead at the following day, and we often talked about it as almost just a spreadsheet as an example, like really trying to find ways to keep it as simple as possible while still being effective, but that you're looking at the 24 hours of the day, you have your resources and your transactions, and you're trying to sort of lay out how that would look. So just at least at a conceptual level, it seemed to be something that would be consistent with how a lot of people might be thinking about setting up their system.
No, that's perfect. Thank you for the clarification, Jeff. I appreciate you chiming in. Let me go to Doug. Thank you for your patience, Doug.
Thanks, Mark. Doug Boccignone, Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. I'm thinking I think we're kind of converging on something here. What I was concerned about when we discussed this last week was that if the CAISO was going to somehow delegate this requirement of, for every scheduling coordinator to have a plan for the operation, whereas I think, what Jeff just described and Stuart was talking about seemed more like each BAA would take the resources that are available to them and create their daily plan. And what I had in mind is, if I were that BAA, I would take the bids that were available to me and do some kind of simple check. Am I going to be able to have enough energy to cover my load for every hour of the day? I translated that to an optimization, not the full-blown market optimization, a simplified optimization, just a check. But what I wanted to avoid was delegating to every single scheduling coordinator a responsibility to come up with their expected energy plan for the next day. That just doesn't seem useful to me.
Gotcha. Thank you for your comments, Doug. And what I heard you state correctly is it's almost a cross between the two. It would be this day ahead plan, and included in that day ahead plan from the EVM entity would be the bids available to them in the bidding tool, which would include some of those resources that they may or may not have ownership rights to or anything like that.
exactly, that they could, I mean, they know the bids are coming in an hour or 2 hours, however, whatever the lead time you need to give yourself. You know, if you get those bids, what are you going to do with them? And what I wanted to avoid is, I mean, there's so much storage is coming. There's a bunch more energy limited resources that we're going to be having in the coming years. If everyone's guessing the same way, I mean, I think one of the things that was discussed last week was, you know, give everyone a target, you know, net load to plan to. I mean, I guess you could do that and everyone got their share of the net load. They could give you their hourly schedule. But I don't know, it just seems like it's not a particularly good use of people's time to do that. So why don't they just provide the bids and then, you know, the BA says, okay, is that bid going to allow me to meet my responsibilities?
Nope, I appreciate you framing it that way, Doug. Can I get a reaction from the audience on that? And then looking at the time here, we are going to move on shortly. Again, we're going to discuss these in much more details in this coming Monday. We'll allow for more time during the week for individuals to put their thoughts together. Feel free to reach out to me if you need my help in any coordination or contact information, you know, among your peers. Let me go to Petter.
Well, I'm going to follow up on what was just said. In the future, with more renewables and more storage, is going to be a very complex task for anybody in Edam or not Edam to prepare daily plan. And you can go with the approach that every individual utility is going to build tools for themselves to do this. And then those tools will be probably unique for that utility, and they will be different than tool CAISO is going to be using for resource efficiency. You have opportunity here to build one common tool that can be as simple as bidding fixed schedules. You prepare your schedules and you submit fixed schedule and you run optimization. Optimization is going to run nothing. It's not going to change anything. It will tell you you're sufficient or not. Or you can go as far as preparing bid, like you're going to bid next hour, and let optimization help you identify in which hours you are insufficient. And then I disagree with Alva. There is a lot of easy things that you can do to move your portfolio around, knowing what you're doing, in which hours you are short. You can move hydro windows. You can move storage, charging and discharging around based on knowing your system. Rerun the tool, and then figure out how far you are to meet sufficiency plan. And to follow up on Kevin's question, I don't believe that we need to do what we do in EIM that test about transmission feasibility, and capacity test and balancing test can be single test that you're feasible for some hour, and you have flex RAM test on top of that. And if you don't do transmission constraints, you're not going to run full market, because today every market run has 3 passes because of transmission. This simplified optimization will have only 1 pass, so it's going to be at least 3 times faster than single NPM or FM run today. So my guess is that this tool can be run probably every 3 to 5 minutes, which would be plenty enough a few hours before 9 a.m. so you can refine your assets and your schedules.
Thank you, Petter. George, I see your hand up. Did you have a response from the discussion you heard, or are we in a good spot to move on and you have some thoughts to take back and be ready for next Monday? There you go.
I'm ready for next Monday. Sorry, I meant to lower my hand.
Oh, no worries. All right. Let's go on to the next slide, Christina. All right, so thank you everyone for your thoughts and considerations on those 2 proposals. It sounds like there were 2 more that kind of came through today's discussions, and sounds like some of it from last week. So I definitely made notes of that and encourage stakeholders to talk offline and to reach out to me to the extent you wish to present on one of those proposals. So getting back to the resource efficiency evaluation, qualification, and counting rules, a few weeks back we talked about demand response, and what that would look like, right? So many entities have demand response programs that do not qualify to be modeled as a resource under the existing rules. So the question here is, how does this supply get accounted for, right? One of the Edam core design principles was to respect IRP and RA programs across the West. So with that in mind, I would like to hear from the audience if they have any ideas or thoughts around how DR would be accounted for. As you can see here, I posed 2 questions just to kind of help get the conversation started. Allow some form of a day-ahead operation plan for unmodeled assets, allow Edam entities the capability to represent DR in the form of load adjustments. So let me pause there and see if I can get a reaction. I see Ryan from Portland with his hand up, so let's go to Ryan.
Yeah, Mark, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
So appreciate the CAISO recognizing the need to account for demand response, but I think we're struggling a bit with the approach here because the question assumes that the load adjustments that were identified in phase 1 of the Rsc Enhancements Initiative draft final proposal either can't or shouldn't be leveraged as an interim measure in both the EIM and EDAM for unmodeled resources. Even asking the question assumes that it might not be appropriate. So it also seems a bit premature to talk about this here when the CAISO has also agreed to establish a working group amongst EIM entities to move forward a discussion on the various demand response programs EIM entities have and how they may or may not align with the current set of modeled resource options available. Mark, I believe you confirmed for us that group won't be initiated until later this spring. So is the CAISO moving forward that group to this group? Because I'm not sure how prudent or effective it is to spitball solutions ahead of that meeting.
Yeah, Ryan, are you referring to the Q4 joint quarterly follow-up around DER discussions and how the forecast would, the interplay with the forecast there?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So yes, the DER discussions are happening internally with the appropriate teams, and there is going to be a follow-up, post Q1 this year around that. I don't believe EDAM was in that context, so I'm going to stop short of anything else as I'm kind of running that DER group. And I'll follow up internally on that. But I see Danny Johnson raising his hand from the policy team. So Danny, did you want to opine on this?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So Ryan, I don't think we're precluding extending the functionality that we're proposing in the EIM RSC of allowing an entity to reflect expected demand response use through lessening the forecast they're tested against. I think what we're asking here is, in the day-ahead timeframe, is similar functionality and a similar approach appropriate? In the EIM, some entities may have a better idea an hour out that they plan to use demand response during tight system conditions than a day out. And we're just trying to assess where the stakeholder community is on a similar approach in the day-ahead timeframe.
So Ryan, I know Portland has a decent-sized DR footprint. Is that something in the day-ahead timeframe that you would also be able to, accurately account for?
I think it is, and I think our preference is to stick with that interim solution. It's tough to offer alternative solutions to that here since we haven't really explored comparisons between the various DR program requirements and the steps that a given EIM entity needs to take to model those resources, because that's going to more precisely identify for me the hurdles and potentially inform alternatives. So I don't really have anything else except for accounting for those programs that aren't modeled in our forecast.
Okay, so with that load adjustment being represented in your forecast for unmodeled DR is what I'm hearing, right? Ryan, you might be on mute on your end, or you dropped off. That's okay. Let me go to, oh, you just came back up. Go ahead, Ryan. I just wanted to confirm I heard you correctly for everybody else.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, you did.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Let me go to Carrie, see if I can get Carrie's reaction. Go ahead, Carrie.
This is Carrie Bentley with Western Power Trading Forum. I just had a question as to whether you were only talking about non-resource DR or whether you would include PDR and RDRR within this.
Yeah, so to the extent it's modeled, I believe there's potentially counting mechanisms within Edam. This slide pertains to current DR that doesn't fit a model within the master file. How is that represented for purposes of counting towards RSC?
I see. In that case, then I agree with Ryan. It seems like you would move forward with your EIM enhancements and then consider whether those enhanced EIM rules would apply here. Oh, thanks.
Okay, thank you. And I know Kathy Anderson from Idaho was definitely interested in this topic when it was last discussed. I don't mean to put you on the spot, Kathy, but the question to you would be, in the day-ahead time frame, going back to what Danny asked, is that something Idaho could recognize as well and account for accurately? And if you wouldn't mind raising your hand, I'd appreciate it. I see Tyler Moore. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, this is Kathy. He unmuted me, so I'm guessing you want to.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah, Kathy at Idaho Power. Accurately, I think is an interesting word. So we know about what we expect in the day ahead when we schedule those. But we could say we're going to get 300 and we get 285 because people turn off their pumps. But we do schedule those in the day ahead and use that to kind of in the day ahead plan internally balance our load. So we could probably do a really close estimate in a day ahead plan.
Understood. But it is possible in the day ahead time frame. Thank you. All right, let me go to Tyler Moore from APS.
Hey, Mark, Tyler here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I just want to give you feedback. I would be similar to Ryan, kind of, I guess, the principle of getting more of these demand response programs able to be modeled as resources, I think is a good step in between where we're at today and where we may be with the EDAM. So the working group and kind of getting those different types and the hurdles in which getting those resources modeled within the program, I think will, the more we can get modeled, the easier this question is to answer. But then, those ones that remain unmodeled, I think we could do a load adjustment type of thing, or, if we land on that optimization kind of semi or light optimization light concept, then maybe there's an avenue that it gets treated similar to like ABC does in EIM, or you could, I guess have a forecast adjustment, some way to say, on that day where this program that's unmodeled could be executed to cover to some extent a shortfall, we could figure out a way to build that into that concept. But similar thoughts to Ryan, and just wanted to mention that the more we get, programs able to model within the optimization and the market, the better off we think we'll be.
Perfect. Thank you, Tyler. I appreciate that. Let me go to Paul Wood from Pacific Corp.
Hey, Mark. Paul Wood, Pacific Corp. I guess listening to these responses, we would probably fall more in line with how Idaho described it. We currently have a pretty good feel for our DR in our day ahead plan, and so we set up that way, with that DR in a load adjustment on the day ahead.
Thank you, Paul. So I've heard Idaho, APS, Portland, and PAC agree with this load adjustment approach outside, as well as WPTF representing their clients. you know, absent a new DR model for these types of resources and programs, is there anyone out there that doesn't necessarily agree with this approach? I would like to hear if there's an opposition. And then while we wait for those to raise their hand, I see Danny with his hand up. Danny, did you want to state something?
Thanks, Mark. So I was thinking about this, and I think this approach makes a lot of sense. And it seems like there's at least a pretty good common agreement for purposes of the RSC, but I'd like to kind of raise then how this demand response would be considered in the market. If an EAM entity is, or an EDAM entity is lowering their RSC demand forecast, would they be able to bid load above what that lowered forecast is and then just try to rely on the EDAM footprint to clear and make sure that they don't eventually have to deploy that demand response during the next day? The same question, I think, would apply to RUC to the extent that a RUC is used. So I'm just trying to figure out what the relationship between is the ability to call DR and day ahead and have that as part of your day ahead plan, and then would there be an expectation that would eventually be deployed in real time? So I'd like to get feedback on that.
No, great question. And maybe I could have those who previously stated their stance around load adjustment, what their thoughts are there. While we wait, let me go to Carrie Bentley.
Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. So I was going to respond to Kathy, but it's appropriate to Danny too. And it's that, you know, our CAISO modeled demand response accuracy is pretty poor. You know, our DR programs, when they're deployed in real time, are very low percentage response, especially, you know, from 5 minute to 5 minute. So in considering how accurate and how well the EDAM entities can deploy their DR, I just don't think we should hold them to a higher standard than our own modeled resources. Thanks.
So Carrie, before you unmute or before Michelle mutes your line, are you stating there may be some performance standard, you know, similar applied here, or?
No, I'm just saying, you know, you asked how well you thought EDAM entities could predict their demand response in real time. And Kathy was saying, oh, you know, you're pretty well, not perfect. And I just want to note that, you know, even when it's modeled and in the market, it's not even pretty good. It's fair, right? The CAISO can fairly predict the demand response that will perform in real time. So I'm not suggesting any sort of performance check, and I actually am advocating the opposite, that there should not be a performance check for the modeled resources or for EDAM entities, you know, trying to bid it in and accurately predicting their program. I think that would require an overhaul of modeled resources as well, which is beyond the scope of this. So more just let's be fair to all DR and admit it's not a perfect resource kind of statement.
Gotcha. Thank you, Carrie. Let me go to Bobby Olson, and then I'm going to go to Alva. Go ahead, Bobby.
Hi, Bobby Olson with SRP. Thanks, Mark. I think Danny's question is an interesting question. I mean, I think SRP, we treat DR maybe a little bit differently. I generally agree with the comments that Idaho and APS and others made regarding how we utilize it. But there's a second way that we utilize it that is worth contemplation as part of EDAM. Getting into RSC and everything else, we will schedule it either in the day ahead, or we'll hold it as an option for real-time execution. And when we hold it as an option for real-time execution, we use it to meet our own uncertainty requirements. And so thinking about how it plays through from an RSC perspective, there may be a benefit to participants to identify how best to deploy it. So depending upon the DR program we have, we can call that either in the day ahead, or we can call that in the real-time environment with an hour or two's notice. And so as a result, we actually treat them differently with respect to either as a resource for load on a day ahead basis or as helping to meet some of the uncertainty. And I hope that that's responsive to Danny's question in terms of how we might utilize it, because that may be something that might be worth exploring.
Thank you, Bobby. I see Danny has his hand up for a response to that. Go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, I think that partially addresses it. I was almost thinking more in terms of just clearing the day-ahead market. I think what you're getting at is like the second aspect of how this flows into real time, but a really simple example is if an entity has 10 megawatts of load and they adjust to have 9 megawatts of load through DR, but then they bid 10 megawatts of load into the day-ahead market and they clear against 10 megawatts of load, effectively, like, the obligation to even utilize that DR would go away. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around the appropriateness of that and how entities would feel about that type of bidding and DR use practices.
Thank you, Danny. All right, I want to go to Alva, and then I'll go to Paul Wood. Go ahead, Alva.
Hi, Alva Svoboda, PG&E. Just a direct response to what Danny was saying. I think it would be a concern when load modifying DR was used essentially to be bid to affect the economic bidding of load. It would seem to me like this is really meant to be more a component of the RUC-like part of this, that it's something that's available as to meet the absolute load forecast in an area as opposed to something to be arbitraged in that way. I just also wanted to point out that I believe in the EIM RSC effort, there was a commitment made by CAISO to monitor, and I don't remember whether there was actually a commitment to report on the effect, essentially whether allowing entities to simply count these programs was effective or accurate. And I think as long as the same kind of requirement is implemented here, it seems like that really is the appropriate approach to take. But there does need to be oversight of some sort. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. No, I appreciate sorry, Alva. Thank you, Alva. Let me go to Paul.
Hey, Mark. Thanks. Paul Wood, Pacificor. I guess from our approach, the way we look at, the demand side resource, we strike it in the day-ahead market, yet we recognize it's a limited resource. So when we get to real time, we put a bid in so that, if it doesn't clear high enough, we will unwind it and then save it for another day and just, cover that obligation, that load adjustment a different way once we get to real time.
Gotcha. So you're saying you recognize that you may call on DR in the day ahead time frame for, let's say, hour ending 20, for example. So as a result of that day ahead quote unquote commitment, in real time, you're putting a bid out there at a given price, and to the extent the LMP supports that, you would call on that DR. If not, you hold it for another time.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Mark. That was okay. That was what I should have said. But yeah, that's
no. I just want to make sure I was following. I'm glad I'm following, because then that would, kind of going back to what Danny stated earlier, is it sounds like when Pacific Corp is leveraging DR in the day-ahead time frame, there is an expectation then to offer that in real time for those hours.
For sure. Yeah, and we recognize. Okay. Look, maybe it's a 4-hour, resource, that DR we can strike. We can either buy those 4 hours in the day-ahead market. We can buy the 16-hour product in the day-ahead market, or we can strike it in our day-ahead resource plan, showing that, hey, look, we'll utilize these this demand resource in the day to balance those 16, 24 hours. You get to real time and you put a bid in there exactly as you stated. If you have to, you strike it. If you can unwind it, you would take that opportunity.
Understood. Thank you. I appreciate you laying that out, Paul. I see Danny with his hand up. Go ahead, Danny.
Thanks, Mark. So just to make sure I'm kind of understanding, what we're almost talking about is like a proxy demand response resource, right? It would kind of be a market resource, but it wouldn't meet the modeling and the telemetry requirements of the current PDR resource model?
Michelle, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Paul Wood's line, I'd appreciate it.
I guess I'm not totally tracking your question. I apologize. Paul Wood, Pacific Corp. We fully intend to utilize that demand response in the day-ahead market. It's a limited use resource over the summer, so there's only so many hours of ability to strike it. So there's definitely a price we would, but if we don't have to, then we would unwind it in real time.
Yeah, so I think that this would just be what you're suggesting is try to model it like a proxy demand response resource, only without that criteria, and then to the extent that the day-ahead market cleared against that, you would plan to utilize that resource going into real time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you. I think I understand.
All right. Thank you, Danny, and thank you, Paul. Let's go to Kathleen. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Great. Yeah, it's Kathleen Colbert from Mistra. It's interesting because I had almost been thinking that that the conversation that I was hearing was less about coming up with a hypothetical PDR, even if it's not modeled in the market, but more so akin to the demand response credits that are used kind of more in the RA space. These include programs that are outside of those that qualify to be supply resources. Was that?
Yeah.
Did I just read into that we were talking about that? Sorry, yeah, I'm trying to connect the dots here.
Maybe, yeah. So we're definitely not diving into RA, but going back to some of those principles.
Just credits.
Right. So going back to the principles, Edam needs to respect the different IRP and RA programs. So part of that is how does a demand response resource that an entity is getting credit for in their forward procurement processes also get the appropriate accreditation in the RSC to the extent everyone agrees. I think that's the conversation we're having, and I hope that helps clarify, Kathleen.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Really, no, thank you, Christina. And I'll apologize for using the word RA. I did not mean to trigger anyone's reaction to that. All I was trying to give a comparison to is that there are processes by which demand response can be reflected as a credit on the load forecast. So think of that as being applied on the demand side of the equation rather than as a supply resource that would be reflected in the supply stack, and that is generally reflected on the supply stack because it's a proxy demand response resource or a reliability demand response resource or participating demand, but it's actually registered as a resource in the market versus a demand response credit is a load modifier on the demand forecast. And I was wondering if we could open it up for some of the entities of whether it would be, what are the pros and cons of the forecast reduction versus going through the process of trying to create and register kind of these hypothetical resources. That's what I was asking.
Gotcha. Thank you. And I do think looking at the EIM enhancements in this space and from the conversation I heard today, it is a load adjustment, which would be on the demand side, if I'm following correctly. And Danny, feel free to raise your hand and chime in here. I don't want to misrepresent the ISO stance. Go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, I think getting back to what Kathleen raised, that there do seem to be two different options, Kathleen and then Pacificor. One option would be representing these through load modifications, and then we'd have to think through what are the appropriate rule sets around that, kind of getting to what I was talking about earlier, is would it be appropriate to bid and load beyond what your forecast load minus demand response would be? The other option would be to, again, model these as almost like a proxy demand response and allow Edam entities to represent their load modification programs in that manner.
As a supply, the quote unquote supply bid?
It would, yeah, I think that is one way that these could be recognized. It would be a third type of demand response model beyond the CAISO's existing PDR and RDR models.
Understood. So new DR model. Thank you, Danny. All right, is there any other comments, questions on DR? And I don't believe I heard any opposition to the load adjustment path. I heard Kathleen's stance or comment on, potentially a new DR model that I think all the entities that spoke up for load adjustment would be in support of as well. I'd like to see if there's any other comments. Kathleen, I'm not sure if your hand is still up from previously or if you had another comment.
Hi, yeah, no, Mark, I just want to clarify, I'm not suggesting anything new, and I wasn't intending to make a proposal. I heard Danny mention this proxy demand response, and I heard it as a third option on top of what you had on your slide, and I just wanted to confirm that I did not mishear something. Thank you.
Gotcha. Thank you, Kathleen. All right. Well, I'm going to pause for one last second. Any other comments on DR before we move to the next slide? All right. So recognizing time, we have about 15, 20 minutes before I turn it over to Bob Cott to kind of summarize today's discussion. I at least wanted to tee up this item. And again, it stems from the kind of common core Edam design elements with respecting IRP and RA programs. So we put together this slide in an attempt to get the conversation started, mainly around the WSPP Schedule C agreements that I believe, and maybe some of the entities that utilize these can kind of speak up and provide context around them, but I believe those are moving to firm transmission. So let me just kind of recite what I see here on the slide, and then I'm going to ask individuals to raise their hand, or those that are utilizing these schedules, to provide a little bit more context. Or if anyone from the ISO also wants to weigh in, I'd appreciate it. So firm energy imports are relied upon across the Western Interconnect to serve load under the varied resource planning and RA paradigms. A common contractual agreement consists of WSPP's Schedule C arrangements. Source and transmission path may not be known by the time of the day-ahead RSC is executed. So without that source and transmission path, how are those reflected to be accounted for towards the RSC, right? These are firm energy agreements, and they're commonly relied on to serve load. So some questions to consider that I really want to open it up to the audience. When is the source and transmission path known? Is the delivery point just system static? How would this arrangement be reflected in a bid? So let me pause there and see if I can get a response from the audience. I'm not seeing any hands, so does that mean nobody across the West utilizes these? Hong Wu from WAPA, go ahead.
This is Tom Wu from WAPA. I don't think there is a specific time that you can say, okay, I know.
Do you mind speaking up a little bit? I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. I could barely hear you.
Maybe I can say. Is it better?
Much better. Thank you, sir.
Okay. I don't think there is a specific time by which you can say, okay, I know definitively the transmission can change, outages can happen anytime before 9. But I would say, if you want something definitive, that probably 9 a.m. At that time, transmission is done. Even after that, although the ISO would freeze the transmission in bilateral market, even after 9, transmission can still change. But 9 would be a good time. Usually by 8, I would say, most of the work are done, all the checkouts. Yeah.
So are you saying by 8 or 9 a.m. the party that is contracting this WSPP Schedule C arrangement would know the source and sink, the path that energy is going to come across?
Yeah, we I don't know how other people do it. We start at 6. The first thing we do at 6 is to check transmission. We made deals from somebody. We assume certain transmission paths, maybe there are outages, maybe something is wrong. So we would start check out with counterparties to confirm the transmission. Usually by 8, things are stable, but things can still happen.
Nope, understood. Thank you for weighing in, Tong. I see Paul Wood from Pacific Corp. I'd like to hear how this works out for Pacific Corp.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, on a day-ahead basis, I mean, Pacific Corp relies, depending on the time of year, with bilateral transactions, these, WSPP Schedule C transactions, to either buy or sell with, a whole host of counterparties. We're not going to know for hours where the source and sink, may be coming from or going. I mean, obviously, if we're buying something that we know we're going to sink, I know the sink. If we're buying or selling something and it's coming off my system, I know the source. But to know the other side of that, I mean, it's early afternoon before we know where that's coming from or where that's going.
Okay. No, that's good to hear. So it's much after that 9 or 10 a.m. bid deadline.
It can be 2 o'clock, maybe even 3 o'clock in a rare, extreme.
Nope, I appreciate that. Let me go to Camille.
Yes. Hi, this is Camille Crispin with Idaho Power. I agree with what Paul just said. Particularly when there's a lot of transactions occurring, it can take several hours to know the other side of the transaction and even more time to get the transmission path nailed down.
Thank you. Let me see if I have any other hands here. Let me go to Jeff Spires.
Hi, Mark. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. Just along the same lines, in today's world, there's a couple of timelines that I think are worth noting and kind of thinking about in the context of how the resource efficiency test would apply and when. One is bilateral trading generally is going on first thing in the morning, so anywhere between 5 a.m. as late as 9 a.m., but I would say that the majority of transactions are probably taking place between sort of 5 and 7 a.m. for the most part. And then the scheduling process after that, like others have pointed out, can be basically taking place at any point during that, starting early in the morning to as late as 3 p.m., which is the day ahead tagging deadline. So I think, trying to find a way to, and just the other thing I would add about that is that I think there is a range in terms of some schedules, some transactions, it's going to be clear what the source and sink is pretty much right away, just given the nature of the contract. There may be forward transactions that are coming in that the entities are already aware of, or transaction between two neighbors where the transmission path is very well defined. And so some of the schedules will be more clear than others. But the one I think one area where there's consistency is that by that 3 p.m. deadline, that's when all the e-tags are submitted that show that information. So trying to find a way to sort of figure out, well, what information do we need to have by, say, the 9 a.m. sufficiency check, and then what might be better validated later in the day, like 3 p.m. or something, to say, okay, these are the transactions that were included in the test. Did the e-tags end up showing up? So I think those are just some of the additional timelines to be considering on a day ahead, from a day ahead scheduling point of view.
No, I appreciate that. So I've heard from a few entities, it sounds like the source and even potentially the sink isn't recognized, associated scheduling point isn't recognized by, the RSC binding run or bid deadline. Does the Edam boundary suffice? We don't know where this energy is coming from. We know it's coming from BAA2 coming to BAA1. How would that get represented for purposes of counting the RSC? Let me go to Kathleen Colbert. I see your hand up.
Hi, yeah, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I'm actually I have some big picture questions to elevate this up really high. I think I understand what we're talking through, but I'm missing some context on why we are talking through some of these things. And let me try to see if I can frame a question to get me that context. So the resource sufficiency evaluation, we're testing for demand, ramping capability, this energy thing that we're going to figure out in some way, shape, or form. And the way that I think about it is that what we need to know is whether or not the bid stack that has been provided to the Edam market operator is sufficient to be used to solve to meet demand, ramping, and now daily energy. The type of offers does not seem relevant to me for a resource sufficiency evaluation check. I would caveat that with, I think if we had import offers in the stack that we're using under the test, that a net import capability limit on that seems very reasonable if you want to do something like that. But that does not have anything to do with forward transmission reservations or even forward contracting. There are import offers into the CAISO and or the Edam's BAA scheduling points or willingness to be counted as an import in the test. So perhaps can I open it up and see if there's some additional context that others can provide to help me understand why we're talking about some of these other items that seem more relevant to other working groups to me?
Annie? Oh, I see Kevin Smith raise his hand. Go ahead, Kevin.
Hi, Kevin Smith Bank. I think it's relevant because, what we're trying to do is determine, what kind of resources should qualify for RSE. And, and so you have to look at what's the full range of resources that are out there. And in some instances, what WSPP represents for most of us who have been transacting under them for decades these types of firm energy arrangements is, are they reliable enough to be added into the stack? And do you have to have associated transmission? And because WSPP it's just a platform with a set of agreed upon terms and conditions, and then you specify your own unique terms under a confirmation. So the WSPP is kind of a broad agreement in the Schedule C, and then you're adding modifications. Those can have a lot of detail. They may not have a lot of detail, but I think for us, knowing that you can continue to utilize them in the RSE, there may not be an associated firm transmission arrangement with that, but it is a firm energy delivery, meaning that it's not
can't be supplanted by economic damages. So you have a firm energy delivery obligation, and in that respect, you know, it should be counted in the RSE. So I think in the bigger picture, Kathleen, for this is I think we're just parsing out the various types of arrangements that might exist, internal resources, and this is just one in the stack of resources that we rely on to meet our daily obligations. And we want to know, I think our proposal is that these should count for RSE, and then, you know, trying to put a little more detail around some of these because they vary. I mean, they could have very, very specific delivery points. Some of these are, you know, short-term transactions. Some of these, you know, are multi-year transactions. Some we know exactly where they're coming from, know exactly what path they're going to be coming from, and then others, you know, it may be nothing more than a delivery point that we know of and, you know, a firm energy delivery obligation. So it's a very broad topic, I guess, is the point, but I do think we need to call them out as individual resources that we rely on.
Thank you for the context and background there, Kevin. Michelle, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Kathleen's line, I'd like to see if that answered her question, and I would also like to hear from the audience here in the next 4 minutes on their reaction to that as well.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mark. And that was really helpful because I was hearing and seeing in the slide a presumption of an earlier conversation that must have occurred along the lines of what I think Kevin helped clear up, of a question of whether or not imports at the border that we would consider counting that come from a source that need to be transported on transmission should qualify or not. And I wasn't party to any kind of debate that the small group had on whether or not these should be included. You know, my thinking is that there shouldn't be limitations on the type of transaction at all, and that, or the type of transmission for the purpose of a resource sufficiency test. So I think that's very in line with Kevin, just to kind of echo it. I don't see why there would need to be a prescription on that. What is important is that when an intertie transaction is cleared, that if we are allowing it to count, and then after the fact it is not tagged, as Jeff mentioned, and it does not show up, because now we're in the world of a few things. Implicit virtuals is we're in the world of that. It gets liquidated and you're settled at a day ahead in real time. Delta, that's something that we should all be very, be mindful of. That's a risk, and one that we want to mitigate as much as possible, that occurs frequently. And also that, it wouldn't necessarily show up in real time. And so that may be quote unquote false counting. But I think that I'd encourage us, if the fear is assurance that we're not allowing too many imports in the test that are not actually expecting to operate or provide or, to show up in real time. I think that there are things like intertie decline charges that we talked a lot about. We talk about intertie deviation penalties. There's some other bigger, some other policy discussions that have been going on for a while on these items. But I think that seems to me kind of more the focus there, and the RSE should support any import offers that can serve that area, with the caveat of the net import capability seems reasonable. But thank you for letting me respond.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Now I'd like to hear, it looks like, Kevin, did you raise your hand again, or was that left up from previously?
I put it up, and real briefly, I just in response, Kathleen, I think the issue is just phantom supply. We want to make sure that supply is real, and that's the intent of the RSE, and that's the intent of why something like a WSPP, which is a firm energy delivery, we want it considered as part of that. But really, at the end of the day, we're looking at assuring that whatever is put into a resource portfolio or RSE is actual supply that's available to the market, not, and that gets into a whole different discussion, but that I just want to make that clear. That's the whole intent of this, and that's in any small group discussion, that's what we've been struggling with, is differentiating between, real and fictional.
Thank you, Kevin. And it sounded like, multiple parties in the West recognize and utilize these WSPP arrangements, and it sounds like there's even different types of them. So to the extent it's a firm energy contract, I want to hear from the audience of whether or not that makes sense to count. I've heard from two parties and it sounds like it does. I see Michelle Keto with her hand up. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, I just have two questions. So one of which is, can somebody clarify whether the WSPP both a firm energy contract where you actually have to deliver the energy versus a firm capacity, or I guess it's not exactly firm, but just as a bid? And then I just want to clarify people's understanding of what a firm energy contract is. Does that require delivery? That would be helpful.
All right, I see Bobby Olson with his hand up. Go ahead, Bobby.
Hey, Bobby Olson with SRP. Michelle, just in response to that question, so WSPP Schedule C, firm energy, we do transact in the Schedule C product, and we do track and manage our counterparties in terms of their compliance and a coordination with delivering firm energy consistent with the contract. We also do use a WSPP Schedule B arrangement from time to time for capacity. As you referenced, that's not a firm contract, but we also treat it more as capacity and resources consistent with our own fleet, adjusted for risks associated with the individual units. Hope that's responsive.
Thank you.
I appreciate it, Bob. Oh, go ahead, Michelle. It sounds like you were good with that response. So I want to do a time check. I want to make sure I give Bob time. This is definitely something it sounds like the group's going to circle back on. I will reach out to some of those parties that execute these WSPP schedules to see maybe if we can get a few slides to help further educate the group on what exactly those look like. So let me turn it over to Bob, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Mark. All right, just quickly, we only have a few minutes left, so I'll just kind of run through the topics we discussed today. Started out with the Edam Resource Efficiency Evaluation Frameworks, which we discussed two that we presented on the slides, bid-based, where sufficiency is demonstrated through bids alone, including an advisory operating schedule, and a day-ahead operating or load resource plan, where sufficiency is demonstrated through a BA or other entity submitted plan. And then there were some other frameworks discussed from stakeholders, a hybrid framework with capacity and aggregate energy test, and then an optimization framework using bids to provide maximum flexibility to fully utilize available resources. Then we moved into the demand response resource discussion, where we talked about unmodeled resources would be considered in load or be modeled in the RSC. There's some discussion about incorporating DR model enhancements as available, and then some question about bidding and use practices with a suggestion that monitoring and oversight might be a good idea. Then we moved into the firm energy imports discussion, where we have day-ahead scheduling time ranges were identified as a concern with maybe some things not known until afternoon. Resource or source or sink details may not be known, as well as the transmission. And it's important to understand how these resources can count against the RSC. The details are important to understand and discuss. And then there are some questions about resources showing up in real time, so we know the resources are real and not phantom supply. And it back to you.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. And, with the last minute here, I do want to thank everyone for their time. And, one thing to note, kind of going back to what Milosh highlighted earlier in the meeting, and a few things that I've been emphasizing on and trying to encourage is we did hear from stakeholders. We did move the working group meetings to just one a week for the next 2 weeks to allow for time for these thoughts and concepts and proposals to kind of sink in, hoping to encourage conversations between stakeholders and then, reach out to me as the facilitator so we can get some of those thoughts and ideas into a presentation and really let the stakeholders drive some of this design. So please utilize that time. We appreciate everyone's time today and have a great rest of your afternoon.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.